Hello, welcome to The Smoking Spot, a really good podcast about weed. I'm Ryan Heron here in Portland, Oregon.
And I'm Amanda Breeze in Toronto. And today I am unbelievably excited because we have an extra special guest on the podcast. Today we have David Jacob Kramer. He is the author of Heads Together, a book that we've been talking about on many episodes, a book that I personally fell in love with the minute I picked it up at the library. And so here we are today, and we get to talk all about it with the author himself. So, David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about this stuff because for a long time, it was a kind of personal obsession that I think I drove my wife crazy talking about it. It's kind of niche, so I'm pleased to have found you two to talk to about it, and hopefully the listeners who are particularly interested in this subject too.
It was one of the featured books at the Cannabis Literary Showcase in March, and it was probably one of the top 5 most picked up books off the shelf because as soon as you see it, you got to pick it up and know more. And what I loved about it was the crossover between activism, culture, and art because it was jam packed with so many amazing images and pieces of history, cannabis history. So, where did the idea come from? Where did it start? Tell us about this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, I think that the way I grew up, let alone the way my parents had their associations with weed, had entirely different connotation. Obviously, in this era, the book covers like 1965 to 1973. I mean, it's striking that weed as a symbol was inextricable from political activism and the counterculture in quite a serious way, as like the book kind of explores. And it's very different, I think, especially here. I'm in LA, whereas here it has entirely different associations. It's like an alternative to pharmaceuticals. It's a wellness commodity. I think over time it's becoming less and less incendiary. The amazing difference in its association and how something that in of itself isn't necessarily incendiary can become associated with subversion and political dissent.
That's actually one of the things that I found most interesting about the book was that the idea behind having all of these underground magazines and publications having even just an image of a cannabis leaf on a page, just hinting at it, not even like the whole article was about cannabis, but just featuring the leaf
Yeah.
was this like super subversive act that was trying to push the culture and push the movement.
Absolutely, and it was the symbol, kind of. I would say the most prevalent symbol. I mean, people talk about like a peace sign, which is maybe like the more Hollywood version, or but in the book, I showcase all these activist groups from like the Yippies, who were very politically active. It was a weed leaf inside a star. There was also this group out of New York called Up Against the Wall, motherfucker,
Yeah.
who were big time activists who did really subversive stuff, like during the trash collecting strikes in downtown New York, which was a kind of poorer neighborhood. They brought all the trash up to uptown and dumped it in kind of water fountain in front of, I think it was Lincoln Center. Their symbol was like the zigzag man. You also see like a bunch of kind of feminist groups who would have like the female symbol with a weed leaf inside it. I mean, I could go on and on. And then so in a sense, it became kind of like proof like of identification with the counterculture. So a lot of these underground papers, even in the masthead design, and they're all super cool, they would incorporate a weed leaf in there, or maybe it would be an animal smoking a joint or something. And that was in association with some very serious like revolutionary ideologies. If you look at another group, the White Panthers, it was the weed leaf crossed over with an M16 machine gun. They were serious about revolution, and they, for a lot of reasons that I will probably go into, weed was perceived on both sides as having potentially revolutionary qualities.
Yeah. The art in the book to me it was speaking so loudly, because although it might just have a little hint of cannabis to the imagery, it's what made it so dynamic. Because I feel like, comparing it to some of the cannabis culture type art we see today, the whole center of it is the pot leaf or the joint, whereas this, it was like embedded into all of these other themes, and really a moment in history, right? And so
Yeah.
it's flipping through the book and seeing the images was like, they're just so next level. Like, how did you find all of this stuff?
It was obsessive, and for better or worse.
I'm imagining you like tiptoeing into like the library archives and like borrowing some stuff for the scanner, you know?
Oh, it was way more. It was so intense. It started off just by, I have a friend who he lives in Echo Park. He has actually an amazing Instagram account called The Family Acid. He has a collection of underground papers. And so it kind of like, he was showing me these and I started sorting. He has a huge, like, it was boxes and boxes that he had in storage. He was a part of the counterculture photographer, and the Family Acid Instagram account is his photos from the 60s and 70s. He was good friends with Bob Marley, so a lot of it is in Jamaica. Anyway, I had this collection. I started sorting through them and I started finding, these are tiny drawings. A lot of them are like the size of postage stamps. And a lot of them are anonymous. You don't even know who the artist was. They have never really been celebrated. You have a lot of kind of well-known names associated with kind of like psychedelic art. Robert Crumb, to Rick Griffin. Like there's to Gilbert Sheldon. Especially with like the weed counterculture as well. But here was this kind of like wealth of stoner drawings that no one was celebrating, no one was spotlighting, and I saw them as a kind of folk art. The way these underground papers worked was they were kind of ideologically amateur. They were modes of activism. People were activists first, and then they learned the skills required to kind of communicate that message. So if they needed a photographer to photograph a rally, you were going to learn how to use a camera. If we needed someone to stay up late and design it, some of these issues, the design changes issue per issue, like dramatically, because it was whoever was in the office. Sometimes it was the same person writing the article, laying it out, taking the photos, doing the little doodle drawings in between the columns, and then selling it on the street. That's the way these things kind of operated, which is a very kind of fertile territory for like free, kind of wild, modes of expression, I suppose, which is the kind of stuff I like. Yeah, so anyone who was in the room at the time could just do a little drawing. So you have these very, very amateur ones. Also, you could recycle any drawing from any other paper. So they would take like a Robert Crumb drawing, add something to it, use it in a flyer for an upcoming rally. They could reappropriate images. They kind of had a life of their own. So there was this kind of like dialogue going on where imagery was evolving, and becoming symbols of the counterculture, just kind of organically. The same drawing that was anonymous, like, I've seen there's a little girl kind of watering a tiny little weed plant that became like all over the place with different messages. Then I've seen it on T-shirts from the time. I've seen it on posters. I've seen it on incest burners. They were just like, this was imagery to be used freely for the sake and benefit of the movement. But it's also the underground press syndicate as a concept was a really kind of unique situation. I think like a phenomenon that hasn't ever been replicated, but nothing like it before or after. Essentially in the mid 60s, there were a bunch of kind of more like bigger city underground papers that were operating, and they felt that there would be a benefit in forming a kind of coalition. So there were five in the beginning: the Los Angeles Free Press, the East Village Other. These are kind of the bigger, more famous ones, and they created this collective called the Underground Press Syndicate. It was very loose. Like literally, it was called the UPS because someone saw a UPS truck driving by at the time.
Whoa, whoa, okay.
They thought it would be funny. So it was called the Underground Press Syndicate, and the only rules were that you could use any material from any other paper. They could share any other, it was non proprietary, but you had to send a copy of your paper every issue to every other paper within the collective.
Oh, wow.
And that's what created this network. And that's how also articles and imagery would get recycled. But within a few years of starting with just five, towards the end of the 60s there were 500, and it was global, and there were millions of readers, and essentially it was this underground press network that fueled the entire counterculture in the 60s. It was what promoted these big music festivals. A lot of really serious countercultural authors from the time, the very famous ones from Hunter S. Thompson to Allen Ginsberg, were contributing to the Underground Press Syndicate, and it, in all elements from art, I think it really kind of influenced popular art. There's a lot of amazing fine artists from very serious museum artists like Ed Ruscha, who designed the logo for other scenes, to Robert Crumb. But also in literature, you had the gonzo amateur style of journalism, just sending kids out to like write about stuff, and they would get arrested at a protest. That really informed like the new journalism movement, of which Hunter S. Thompson is a major exponent. And Joan Didion said that to her, and I quoted this in the book, she said the underground press type of journalism was the only real kind of journalism, because you knew the journalist's intentions from the jump. They weren't trying to pretend to be impartial. They weren't trying to hide their journalistic bias. They were just straight up reporting what happened to them and sharing their opinions. And they were reporting on things that mainstream newspapers weren't reporting on. At the time, newspapers were generally like regurgitating the government line on, the Vietnam War, ignoring a lot of, race inequity, and also a lot of stuff that was happening amongst like minority communities in LA, for instance. You had in East LA, you had a lot of like part of the Chicano movement. There was a lot of student walkouts because of the inequalities in like public schools, and the LA Times just wasn't reporting on it. So the Los Angeles Free Press helped kind of amplify a small Chicano underground paper called La Raza. La Raza sent a bunch of journalists to cover this protest. They all got arrested, which means the next issue didn't come out. The LA Free Press put it out for them, reported what they had reported. And then these stories get picked up around the world by other, like, in Switzerland, you might have a paper reporting about what's happening, in East LA, when the LA
Wow.
Times wasn't reporting on it. So it really gave a voice to communities that didn't have a voice, whether they were like radical revolutionary politicos, whether they were, minority communities, or also they were just kind of like freaky people with crazy ideas.
Damn, wow, that's very cool. So you were like at a friend's house and he showed you a bunch of stamps sized art and you thought this is a book.
Yeah. Yes.
Like how did you find this? Where did this all come from?
I knew about the underground press and I was always really into it. And I'd seen a lot of books about it. I used to have a bookstore in
Oh,
LA,
neat.
and we had like carried books about, the underground press. And there's a few kind of like specialized ones. There's ones on like the underground press in the UK. There was one on like the sexual revolution in the underground press. I think I was also smoking a lot of weed at the time, and seeing these drawings, they were so funny and silly. Like in the book, I have like an index. So if you wanted to look for, because it's a 550-page book, there's
Oh, it's big and heavy with a lot. There's a lot in there.
tons of these goofy drawings. And so if you had a particular kind of drawing, you want, like, let's say you want to find a tomato smoking weed, you can go to the back in the index and look for tomato smoking weed. So there's like different categories, like animals smoking weed. I think I even have like turtles, because for some reason a lot of turtles smoking weed. And there's also different categories as well, like because as I was saying, every different group, like there were queer groups who adopted the symbol. So there was a lesbian underground paper called Lavender Vision. They would have drawings of naked women smoking weed. There was a gay journal that had the same thing. So whatever topic you're interested in associated with smoking weed, you can go to this index and find imagery associated with it. Anyway, so like it kind of captured my imagination, and also noting that the associations with weed were so different to my associations at the time with what was happening in California, where my experience was so different. If I go to a dispensary, thank God, I can say, okay, I want outdoor grown, this strain from this farm, from this location. This was so wildly different. And but you can see this is the beginning of it. This was the beginning of Northern California learning how to grow weed. I mean, there's a part of the book as well, a big chunk associated to early grower guides from the 60s and early 70s. This is before they knew how to like mass produce sinsemilla. They didn't know how to do it yet. They're just like, a lot of these guides are kind of worthless as guides, but you can see the beginning of this knowledge emerging, which is, now highly capitalized on. But then it was part of a bigger self-education movement, associated with going back to the land, learning skills, building your own house, farming your own land, and growing your own weed, and then giving it away. This is the beginning, basically, of the legalization movement that has been super successful. But I mean, the beginning of the legalization movement could be traced to like the Lower East Side in 1964 with the first organization called Lamar or Limar, which is basically an abbreviation of legalized marijuana. But the people involved in that organization, there was only a few, and it was Allen Ginsberg, it was Ed Sanders, who is a poet who had a bookstore in the Lower East Side, and this guy Richard Aldrich, who had written the first PhD ever on weed smoking, the history of it, and it's almost like an anthropological study. So, to answer your question way back about how I was finding this material, I tracked down Richard Aldrich, who is still living in the Bay, has a house, a tiny apartment. He lives in a studio apartment with his wife, Michelle, who's also an activist. They must be in their 80s, but his apartment is chalk. You can barely move because he's been collecting bongs for like 60 years. And
What?
he has thousands of bongs from around the world, like
Yes.
from all different cultures. It was actually, to be honest, because I was already in the midst of collecting this material, it was a little bit of like a good warning of what could happen to me if I keep going on this.
Yeah. You're like, that stack is going to take over if I let it.
Yeah, like the stack was growing at that point, and I was like, okay, once this book is done, I gotta calm down. But yeah, he took me. We drove to his storage facility, which was like an hour north, and he just had the most incredible stuff. Just letters from Allen Ginsberg, because he was Allen Ginsberg's secretary, personal
Whoa.
secretary, and he just had all these. He just had all this material, and we gathered it, took it back to his apartment, scanned it. That's just how some of that material came. But then there's an amazing archive in Brooklyn called Interference Archive, which is all about political activism. And someone generously donated a massive collection of underground papers. And they have an oversized scanner there, and they let me spend 3 days pouring through all this material. I went to Germany because there was a distributor who distributed underground newspapers in Germany, and when he died in the 80s, this university just took his entire collection, and he had kept one of everything. So it's in this basement, like it's almost like a bomb shelter. I think there's no windows. It's this basement that rarely, I think, people go down into. And I spent a week down there with this insane collection. Unfortunately, it went beyond the years that I was like focusing on. So it meant I had to sort through a lot of stuff. But all the stuff I wasn't looking at was amazing too. So it made it even harder. I was like, I have to focus if I'm ever gonna get through all this, And then I had to go. There's another small town in Germany that had another collection that was equally amazing, but much more selective. It was someone's personal collection that they had. Yeah, it was many, many days looking through dusty old newspapers and then getting really excited about finding a tomato smoking weed.
Like, how did you narrow down the things that you included in the publication? Because there's so much there.
Could have kept going. I could have. And it was my designer who stopped me. And he was like, first of all, it becomes impossible if someone just keeps dumping material on you and you're trying to design a book. That becomes untenable. But he would just point out, like, okay, we get the idea. There were a lot of drawings of, vegetable smoking weed. How many more do we need? And I'm like, dude, I found this archive. Let me just go in there. And then I would dump 5 more. And I'm excited about it. He's like, I don't know if this really enhanced the book. But to me, it did. We had to cut a lot out as well. And it was like heartbreaking to me. So to deal with that pain, I started an Instagram account with the offcuts.
Oh, nice. Yes.
For listeners who want to follow, it's Heads Together Book. That's the handle. And yeah, and it's also allowed me now when I find more, because people send me more, I don't get frustrated about, like, God, that would have been awesome to have in there. I can now at least have an outlet for it.
Yeah, well, especially if all of this stuff is just sitting in basements, in bunkers, like
Yeah.
it was truly so inspiring to just flip through the book. And when I picked it up, I had no idea. It just said weed, I like books. I thought I'd pick it up. There was some hype around it. This book just came out last year, so it's pretty new. And I felt so inspired myself by the art and the collection. So I totally understand why you would be like compelled to like start to bring it all together and share it.
Yeah, yeah. I First of all, thank you so much. That's really nice. I'm glad that you were able to like engage with it, because I didn't want it to feel like inaccessible, or that it required a ton of context. You can kind of engage with it how you want. Like, there's a lot of kind of contextual little captions throughout the book to just offer, like, okay, I'm including this in here because these are who Up Against the Wall motherfuckers were. They terrorized Bill Graham at the Fillmore, forced him to give them a night where they could do free shows, and then also forced the local underground paper called it was in New York, called The Rat. They got their own page, and they would just come in at 2 a.m. and do their collage and then leave. So it's important to have little bits of context, these little stories. I also, in addition to like collecting the artwork, I did a very maybe too deep a dive into the kind of, there's quite a bit of writing, a lot of memoirs by editors on the underground from the underground press, people who contributed. I also interviewed a lot of them. I included oral histories from people who had worked on them at the time, and their experiences. So I got a lot of anecdotes, and there was a lot of like little stories, and this thing was so sprawling and so enmeshed in all the activity that was going on at the time, that and there's just crazy stories. It was a crazy time. I mean, just to talk about like why weed was such a powerful symbol then, was because the government was very afraid of these underground papers. They were, because they were feeding the counterculture, and especially when Nixon gets into office, recordings show him being like vocally threatened by what was going on with these underground papers. Yet it would have been very hard to take the editors to court and say, this is anti-government activity promoting political subversion. The easiest way to shut these papers down was just to bust them for weed, just to like raid the office and just find someone with weed on them.
Right.
So, and that's what they did. And it was no one, they were paranoid about this. They were like, do you have weed on you? The government thinks that if we smoke enough weed, we're going to like overthrow the government. And they keep raiding our offices for weed. They thought the government was scared of weed, not the, I mean, I'm being reductive, but they thought the government must have been scared of all this weed because they were going so crazy, busting everyone for it.
Well, and how crazy is that? I mean, we've seen that throughout time, stop and frisk. But interestingly, Candid Kush, who we had on, Chris, said that was their main way for busting camps at Burning Man the last couple of years.
Exactly.
Was if somebody had weed, it was like a free license to come in and see what else they had, or to get them out of there, hit them with a heavy
And you see
fine.
that in the 80s, people of color for sure, and which is why I kind of also, I felt like this was important to show how laws can change, and in a way how kind of like arbitrary they are, and how weed occupied this heightened kind of outsized position just because it was politically convenient. You see how certain things become, lightning rod issues. I feel like you saw it during COVID suddenly. Face mask, whether you wear a face mask or not determines a political ideology. It's like,
Right.
dude, this is just a thing to like, it's a it's just a thing to cover your face, but yet it became such a potent symbol of your political ideology. That's the first thing that jumps to mind when I think about how weed was so politicized, and there was so much paranoia around it, and it was warranted. That was the craziest thing. They're like, Richard Aldrich said that they were surveilling their telephone lines on the underground paper. He was the editor of the Marijuana Review, which was a member of the Underground Press Syndicate, and he found out that they were wiretapping him. So he just had someone read the entirety of Henry Miller's Tropic of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer out loud on the phone endlessly, just to drive them nuts.
But I think that's why that this whole movement is so alluring to activists like myself, because some of it was so serious and what was happening, these are people's lives, right? But at the same time, they were always so funny.
Yeah,
Like the hippie movement is just like a movement of contradictions and
yeah,
hilarity and backwards thinking. And I'm just like the revolution for the hell of it and that whole vibe that was there. And so it's interesting to hear and remember how serious this actually really was.
totally. I mean, the Yippies are amazing because they were kind of like more inspired by like Madison Avenue and doing kind of like stunts. They were, because they were like, how are we going to get this message to the people? And there was like a war between them and the more serious new leftist politicos, because the new left kind of saw the Yippies as jokers. They were like, okay, oh, there's going to be a revolution through weed. There's not going to be a revolution through weed. You're totally kidding. It's going to come from the working class and blah blah blah. And they were very erudite in like Marxist philosophy, and the Yippies were like, no one gives a shit. We're being far more powerful by politicizing people through like pot and music and rock and roll than you are with your kind of like sanctimonious political theory. And in the underground press in the early, like kind of mid 60s, that intermingling of kind of like new left, kind of politico, more austere, serious political activism, it mixed really well with the kind of like psychedelic, kind of trippy art and all that stuff. It was really dynamic, that intermingling. They helped each other. The political theory helped kind of justify or give credibility to the psychedelic side, and the psychedelic side kind of made the political side more kind of like accessible and sexier. And it worked really well. But then these papers started going to war with each other, and it's what happens in a lot of kind of like leftist movements. There, you get these schisms, and they start cannibalizing each other, and that's really what happened with these underground papers. And it got violent at times. There was the Liberation News Service, which was kind of like the Reuters for the underground press. They just sent out news packets to all the papers. There was like at some point, the fighting was so serious between them that the kind of the freaks, as they were called, it was like a war between, it was like politicos versus freaks, essentially. They didn't steal, they just took all the printing equipment and in the middle of the night and drove it upstate. And the Politico side were like, okay, we're going to track them down, found them, and at gunpoint made them tell them, confess to where the equipment was, and they got it all back.
Wow.
It got, especially because the kind of ideologies that they were espousing they were very serious about it. This is like in a time of like the Weathermen blowing up buildings. The Vietnam War, by like 1970, 71, it was kids were getting shot. You had Kent State, protesters were getting shot. This was really serious, and people were willing to go to extremes to overthrow the kind of dominant paradigm. So, and that's how that's where you get like a weed leaf and a machine gun crossed over, because that was believed to be a means of revolution.
I just find it so inspiring. I mean, even today, part of my reason for wanting to talk to you today was the that the book was such an inspiration for creating my cannabis literary showcase a few months ago, because it really just reminded me, and through like the poetry of the art and the poetry of the writing, and the movement, how important publications are. And where cannabis is still heavily censored today, not like it was, not like it in that way here now. You're in Cali, Ryan's in Portland, I'm in fucking Canada, so it's all very chill where we
Mm.
are. But it's just still so inspiring to me. Like, what like message were you hoping to get across? Is that what you were hoping people would find inspiration, or were you hoping to just create a compendium of one place for all of these beautiful bits and pieces of the history of our movement?
I It's a good question. I think number one, like the way I grew up was that weed had very wholesome connotations. Like I have hippie parents, and it was for me associated with the weekend, the adults kind of like smoking weed around the dinner table, people being happy. It was, we're going to eat ice cream and watch movies. Not that I was smoking weed as a kid, obviously. It was not, it was definitely withheld from me, don't worry. But, and then as a teenager, I started seeing kind of the dissonance of that association with its obvious illegality. And I grew up in Australia where, it's still illegal. And also, I think I was just interested in exploring. It's, you grow up with hippie parents. That's a whole thing. Like, it's hard to rebel against hippie parents, and I was trying to understand what kind of, yeah, like what informed them that then informed me. And also, I think there's a lot about that movement that Hollywood and the media have kind of projected that's not accurate. There's kind of like a bunch of platitudes and cliches associated with that movement that might be associated with some aspect of it, but there's a lot of insanity, a lot of literature and music that isn't kind of part of the canon per se. So and it's a weird, interesting time in terms of like the message from the book. Everyone involved in these papers kind of just wanted to make things better. They had very intense optimism, a feeling of empowerment to actually like. There was a sense that I mean, literally, the idea that I don't know many people who genuinely believe that a revolution is possible, let alone via smoking pot. There's something about that. It could be naive, but I admire the spirit of it, to have that kind of conviction and willingness to act on it rather than being jaded or whether or not it's real or not. I think the sentiment is positive and deserves to be celebrated. Whether it's delusional, whether it was successful, I'm not even trying to make like draw conclusions. It's more just in the manner I find exciting and inspiring. The manner with which they enacted these things, through making newspapers, throwing parties, smoking weed. Those are, I think, an unusual means of trying to make the world a better place.
Yeah, and the art is inspirational. That's the other thing. The art is actually inspirational. These things, even today, I'm seeing people flip through it and being wowed and inspired to do creative things as well. So it's like
Totally.
it's the that spirit is still alive in the work today.
Yeah, and that they gave a platform to like very strange amateur drawings. Like they felt like these drawings should be published.
Yeah, I didn't even really think of it like that.
Like some of these drawings, reached literally like over 1 million people. And these are young people. These were young artists. Like I interviewed for the book some of the artists who were involved at the time, and they were, you could say, like they said, you could say I'm not getting paid. I was getting paid by one paper, very little. And suddenly I go to like an underground bookstore and I'm seeing my drawings in multiple papers across the world. It's like, I didn't get mad about it. I was, as like, he's like, as a 21-year-old kid who's just starting to try to become an artist, this was incredible to me to have that kind of platform and to feel like that many people were, and to have that many applications for these drawings, that they became so ubiquitous was, thrilling. And that they would meet musicians who knew their work. It was a great means of creating community and dialogue between all these different artists in different mediums.
And well, and even though this was from the 60s and 70s, Amanda, I think when you're saying that people instantly gravitate to this art style, hey, us kids of like the 90s grew up with Mad Magazine and handfuls of zines that were made from like all manner of people. And all of those were informed by this underground press syndicate style or partly of. So it's really cool to go back and kind of be able to look at the birth of some of these styles that still reverberate today, and we can still find, in weed iconography, even though it's so kind of like corporate washed now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what's interesting is the legalization movement in the beginning was very prescient about what was going to happen and wary of it. There, you can see like they made fake. Seriously, this is in the '60s. You see these people creating fake packaging for what would 50 years later become legal weed, and they're talking about what it's going to become. They're like, this will be completely divorced from any political activism, nothing more than like a tranquilizer or productivity enhancer. It's amazing to see that, and for them, there was like a movement. They didn't like drug dealers, because drug dealers were profiting from the sacred herb that you see in their little like classifieds. Hey, I've got some swamp weed. I would trade someone who's got some like North California Kush. Anyone want to trade with me? The mission statement of Amorphia, which grew out of Lamar, was we want free backyard weed. That was kind of the idea. They didn't want to capitalize on it because they had so much like faith in its kind of munificent properties, and what it could, was going to save humanity. You can't make money off something like that.
I love that. That's so cool. So, is there anything else about the book that you really want to share with our audience that we haven't hit?
Yeah, I mean the other aspects of that, which I'm just realizing as I was saying that, is it's a little bit of an irony, because the director of the Underground Press Syndicate was this guy Tom Forsad. You might have heard of, because he founded High Times magazine. But he funded some activities of the underground press, at least funded himself, by illegally smuggling weed into America. So in a way, it was weed that funded a ton of like the success of the underground press syndicate. And in 1973, when you start seeing its decline, he knew how popular weed was by 1973. There's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, during the Vietnam War, you had a lot of soldiers who wouldn't. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, I mean, weed was largely like an urban kind of pastime. It was like a hip thing to have, knowledge of or access to. But then in Vietnam, you have all these people from the suburbs and small towns being exposed to weed, and they weren't necessarily revolutionaries. They might have been farmers or mechanics, and they come back to the States and they just want to smoke weed. So you see like suburban head shops start opening up in like the early '70s. And Tom Forsad kind of like saw this because he knew how popular it was in the underground press. And he's like, what if I just make, he had like the data, he was like, what if I just make a magazine just about smoking weed? And High Times is born, and it's incredibly successful, competing with Rolling Stone magazine. And he does maintain some of the same, at least some of the same. It was a different time, but what he brought to the Underground Press Syndicate still informed some of the editorial point of view of High Times. Although by that time, I think the idea of revolution was fading into the '70s.
I'm an 86. I was born in 86. Okay. So the 90s into the 2000s. I remember my first High Times magazine. And at that point it's very well established. It's like you're saying, on par with like a Rolling Stone for the subculture, but I still found that was the community. I was like, oh, there's other people who are thinking about pot and smoking weed, even though you're just like a little high school dirtbag. It was still a moment that it's still part of the rite of passage was picking up your first high times. So it makes sense to me that it would continue to flow even into the 90s and now into legalization.
Totally does. It totally, I mean, like, I remember seeing kids wearing like Dr. Dre t-shirts, like the Chronic, and
Yeah.
that had the same it was like those were like, had the same incendiary kind of like political association in a way as what it was for hippies back then. But yeah, it carried on, and it was also those policies in the 80s made weed that much more kind of like subversive as a symbol to wear on a t-shirt. So it was kind of the same thing.
So, other than the tomato and the turtle, did you have any favorite moments when you were like, I keep coming back to the art because I loved it so much, but
Yeah.
did you have anything, favorite facts or favorite pieces that really just like,
I like the kind of the sillier, the less professional it looked. So they wanted these papers to like look like newspapers, but also be the opposite to newspapers. Hence the insane maximalist design where text is all crammed in and every little spare space was filled with these little illustrations. So sometimes like yeah, I discovered artists that I don't think anyone's like really heard of before, and I would find these names of different, and I would Google them, and there was very, very little about them. So it was kind of like what was exciting to me was like discovering these people that didn't reach the canon. I mean, one of my favorites was this woman, Hetty McLeese. She did, I mean, her life. So when I got really excited about her, because I was like, I keep seeing this artist, like who is this person? I started researching her. She was married to this guy Angus McLeese, who was the original drummer in the Velvet Underground. On the internet, she wrote before she passed away, wrote a memoir. Her life is incredible. Like she dated Pigpen from the Grateful Dead. She moved to Tibet at a certain point, and her son became ordained as a lama, highly venerated, and still to this day lives there. He was like a child llama. She was the one she had for a while in New York, a thrift store where she did like leather works. She made the leather fringed vest that Jimi Hendrix wore at Woodstock. Like it just goes
Wow.
on and on and on how like amazing her life was. And her art is so cool. She did the back cover of almost for like a year every East Village other, because there was like a record label that hired her to just do the art for every single like ad. So there's a lot of her work, and she's not like you see the celebrated figures of psychedelic art, and I feel like she was kind of like left out. She was the first person. She lived in San Francisco. She put paint, different colored paint, in ketchup bottles as they were printing. She would squirt them into the press, and it created that kind of like spectrum that is very heavily associated with the underground press, if not the entire psychedelic movement at large. For the Oracle, which is maybe one of the coolest looking underground newspapers there was, she invented that, which became really like adopted heavily. And like, how do you get credit for that? It's a footnote, but it's super important. It's these people that were really influential in in these ways that have gone off the record that I think I wanted to spotlight in the book.
well, honestly, David, I could listen to you talk forever. I'm not even exaggerating. Literally, thank you for coming up with this, for putting this book together. It's fantastic. I hope everyone who sees this, hears this, goes out and gets a copy because it's kind of life changing. If you're someone who's in the cannabis community, especially like myself and Ryan, like we pull inspiration from this. And so, like, genuinely, as your super fan, thank you for writing and putting together this publication.
Thanks so much for listening to all that. I rarely get the opportunity to just like ramble for that long. So
Oh
thank you.
no, we could keep going.
I mean, when you're documenting history and pulling things from sources people have not seen in 50 years or so, and really preserving this for us all, and hopefully, your copies will survive another 50 years until somebody wants to archive all of that. It's really nice for us who are trying to push this thing forward to keep all of this stuff that, as we know, the internet feels like it's forever, but it's really not. And things disappear and go missing from it all the time. So to have these hard physical copies.
That's so true. I mean, these papers are literally like in my hands. Some of them were disintegrating. So I'm glad to be able to contribute to the history of stoner drawings.
Keeping the history alive. So where should people order your book or find you?
Oh, yeah, definitely follow Heads Together book. And I'm continually finding more and more of these drawings that I'm adding to it. You can get the book at, I think, most good bookstores, or go to artbook.com and you can pick it up there. It's very thick, so you'll get your money's worth. You can look at it for many, many hours.
I did overkeep my copy from the library. I don't want to say
Okay.
how long, but it was more than 6 months. And
Okay.
so there's a lot in there to go through, and it's a keeper. It's a book that you'll keep going back to for sure. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you guys. Thanks. Really appreciate it.
David Jacob Kramer, author of Heads Together. You know where you can find me and Ryan. We're at the smoking spot. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll chat with you guys next week.
Thanks so much.
Said no matter what kind of pain and anguish life may bring you, oh, smoke it up, hold it down, and don't ever stop. Well, you can always find your smoking spot. Yeah, you can always find your smoking spot.